Welcome back to the Real News Network. We're talking about, is Karl Marx relevant to today? And once again, we're talking about with Leo Panitch, whose article in the recent Foreign Policy magazine about the relevancy of Karl Marx to today. Thanks for joining us again, Leo. Leo is a professor of political science at York University in Toronto. Also, he's the author of the book Renewing Socialism. So, let's talk about some specifics about what relevancy Marx has to, and we're going to fill in the blank. So let's start with climate change. The reason I picked climate change is there's a big debate going on in Washington right now and also in Canada on just what are the mechanisms to deal with carbon emissions. And there's this debate between cap and trade, which is to create a market, which you can explain to us more, carbon tax or regulation. And the Obama administration recently said, and so did the EPA in the United States, say that they're quite wedded to the idea of cap and trade. And they're not interested in much regulation. So what does Marx tell us about this?
The relevance of Marx to this issue is limited in some ways because Marx didn't foresee the climate crisis. I think that has to be said. He was, however, very sensitive to the way in which capitalism was feeding off nature, often destroying nature and destroying the sustenance of human society through the contradictions of industrial capitalism. We see it in the cap and trade proposal, what Marx was on about, in terms of the attempt to find market solutions, commodified solutions, solutions based on derivatives for the emissions problem. It's not only a matter of what Obama's putting forward by cap and trade or what's being put forward virtually by every green liberal and for that matter green social democrat in the world today. The whole Kyoto plan is based on precisely a trade in emission standards, and this is the trade in derivatives products. It's the trade in a security that a firm has by virtue of not going over their level, staying under it, which is then
explain the basic, because some people may not know what cap and trade is.
The government sets a standard, which is what the cap is. You can't emit over a certain level. And it will issue a certificate to those firms that don't go over, that stay under. Those firms can then trade those certificates to another firm that goes over. And they use those in order not to go to jail or pay a penalty. So you get a trade in derivatives products, financial products, that is, of course, it costs them insofar as they have to buy that security, it's costing them something. But you're getting a trade in derivative products. This is the kind of trade in financial instruments that brought us to this mess. And for us to attempt to resolve the climate crisis by relying on that volatile, open to manipulation and crisis-ridden mechanism is a disaster. And why people are proposing it is that they're afraid to talk about planning. And you can't really imagine, given the seriousness of this crisis, that humanity can solve it without returning to a form of economic planning. We'd like it to be democratic economic planning as opposed to the bureaucratic central planning that we knew. But it's impossible that it can be done through this kind of system. And this crisis, and Marx would tell you that this crisis produces this. Now, in order to do that, it leads on to the next thing. In order to do that, yes, you probably do have to have a banking system that isn't just regulated, but is a public utility. Is a repository of a democratic accountable state, which directs the funds that pass through the banking system in such a way that the climate crisis, the type of production we need in order not to be destroying nature, does in fact happen. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to deal with this. And then it applies thirdly to what's happening to the auto sector and the conversion that ought to be taking place in it. The whole of the parts industry, which is tanking, ought to be taken into public ownership, and all of the enormous skills, the tool and die makers and the machinery, that is all now going down the drain. A legacy of generations of training, of engineers, of workers, etc., is being dumped. Whereas what we need is to convert that industry into ecologically sustainable types of production. There's no reason that tool and die makers can't be making solar panels. But in order to do that, you have to have a banking system that will lend into that conversion. So it is all connected, and one of the fifth of the 10 things that Marx called for in the Communist Manifesto was to take the banks into the hands of the state. And you're hearing that now from all kinds of non-Marxist quarters, because in the face of this crisis, it's rational.
The talk of anything that suggests taking control of the market or planning, and the auto industry is a good example, where you have a situation where the government's actually going to own, together with the unions, a majority of GM and Chrysler, but they're leaving the present management in place. The union's going to have one board member. When the new president of GM was asked, how are you going to bring GM back, he essentially said, by creating small, stylish cars. Yeah. In other words, get back to hopefully where they were, with a little bit, maybe the odd battery car thrown in here and there. Yeah. So if what Marx has to tell us about climate change, banking, and the auto industry requires this kind of planning, American politics is 100 million miles away from that.
100 million miles away in two senses. One is, does the state, after all of these years of atrophying, going back since the Second World War, when the state was highly capable, right, of converting the auto industry into the production of air fuselages, right? It's no longer the case. It doesn't have that capacity. So yes, the state would have to be changed, not only so that it's democratic, but it has the technical capacity to be able to do this. But then more than this, Marx was not about offering policy advice to capitalist states. It isn't a matter of bringing this to Obama.
He did write a letter congratulating Abraham Lincoln.
Well, yes, he was very happy to see slavery undone. But in terms of proposing to existing capitalist governments that they ought to introduce socialism, he wasn't that naive. He was the greater realist. What Marx was about was trying to encourage people to overcome their social isolation, which is produced in this market individualist commodified society, to create new social identities, new political identities, new collective identities, and organizations that express those, and undertake a massive social and political transformation.
But still, they've put forward and supported demands that led to certain kinds of legislation, whether it was an 8-hour working day or other sorts of things.
Yes, but those things don't just happen by policy advice. Marx's main emphasis was to build movements,
to make demands.
That, of course, would try to win people to it by making immediate demands. He advocated the 8-hour working day.
The fundamental resistance to this in many countries, but particularly in the United States, which doesn't even have much of a social democratic tradition. They envision, some of the Republicans in Congress just debating health care. The great Satan right now is Sweden as the socialist menace.
Yeah, but they aren't getting many votes these days, so maybe that's...
but you're seeing very similar things within the conservative Democrats. It's not just the Republicans. In fact, right now it's possible that within the conservative Democrats, led by Baucus on the Finance Committee, may actually be creating a situation where there won't be a public component of American healthcare reform.
Yes, I've seen that.
This is certainly not just some Republican.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Yeah.
But the core of all of this is that planning, anything to do with the word socialism, government intervention, all denies individual rights. And that's the core of what the resistance, at least at the ideological propaganda level, is. Yeah. So in the next segment of our interview, let's talk about that. Does this kind of planning, this kind of vision you're articulating, does that mean the abolition of individual rights? And if we go back to the cover of Foreign Policy, which is the magazine Leo's article was in, and we go back to bread, potatoes, and propaganda. This is supposed to be the vision of what state planning is. So, is it? Please join us for the next segment of our interview with Leo Panitch on the Real News Network.
Donate today and receive a new documentary film available to members of the Real News Network. The History of the National Security State with legendary author Gore Vidal. Bonus features of the DVD include an in-depth response to Vidal from ex-CIA analyst Ray McGovern, who served under 7 U.S. presidents, an exclusive interview with Colin Powell's former Chief of Staff Larry Wilkerson, and an insightful interview with oil policy analyst Antonia Juhas.
The news America's magazine of the screen. Living glimpses of history in the making.
Hollywood and Washington, there's a symbiotic relationship. They both deal with illusions. Reality doesn't often play much of a part. I think I saw through the myth of the Cold War almost from the beginning. I was a Washington political kid from a political family. Roosevelt first had radio because he had this great speaking voice and everyone liked to hear. Truman proceeded to break every arrangement that Roosevelt had set up for a peaceful coexistence. And Truman thought that it would be a good idea. Why not just stay armed all the time? And then he devised the national security state. You've got to go up and swear allegiance to the United States or else you're a commie. I mean, we had imported fascism. We get Dwight Eisenhower, who said that we have this great military industrial complex. It is a dangerous thing. And he said this is going to change everything. And the way our country's governed is going to change us politically. Along comes Jack Kennedy, who wanted to make his mark, believed in the Cold War. But he said in this kind of politics, it is the appearance of things that matters. I think everybody should take a sober look at the world about us. The national security state still exists, only it isn't communism anymore, it's terrorism. This is the most serious thing that has happened in the history of the United States. Knowledge is power. We need an honest news system.
We need the real news.
This is the sort of thing we can build right now without anyone else's permission from the government or from the business community. It's the power's in our hands.
If we're not going to sleepwalk into more wars, we think we need to start with a television news network that won't bow to pressure and has the courage to seek facts. And that means independent economics. And that's why we need you.
Make a tax-deductible donation now of at least $10 a month or a one-time give of at least $75. As a thank you for your support, we will send you the new documentary film, The History of the National Security State.